is, hotshot. There's a bomb on a bus. Once the bus goes 50 miles an hour, the bomb is armed. If it drops below 50, it blows up. What do you do? What do you do?
On the morning of March 24, 2010, Dennis Hopper, the actor, director, photographer, artist, and one of the most enduring countercultural icons in American cinema, leaned on his assistant's arm as he stepped off the red carpet and up onto a makeshift stage on Hollywood Boulevard, where, in just a few minutes, he would be honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. For more than 4 decades, Hopper's distinctive features, deep-set eyes, sharp cheekbones, and an intense, often glowering expression, had made him one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures in movies like Easy Rider, Blue Velvet, Apocalypse Now, Hoosiers, and so many other classics. But 4 months before his appearance at the Walk of Fame, Hopper was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and the ensuing battle against the disease took a brutal toll on the actor's physical health. Those who gathered that day, including Hopper's fans, entertainment journalists, and a constellation of his famous friends, were visibly shaken by his appearance. Hopper looked impossibly gaunt and frail, nearly lost beneath a tweed newsboy cap and an oversized wool coat that was out of place on the warm day. The fiery, wild-eyed rebel was now a pale shadow of his former self. Though the cancer had ravaged his body, it wasn't the only battle he was fighting. Over the last few months, Hopper was embroiled in a bitter divorce with his 5th wife, Victoria Duffy, a legal war that played out in tabloid headlines and courtrooms even as he faced his terminal diagnosis. The marriage had been tumultuous for years, but his declining health seemed to escalate tensions. In January 2010, Hopper filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, though friends and family suspected the real motivation was his desire to cut ties before his death. Duffy, who was 32 years younger than Hopper and the mother of his youngest daughter, 9-year-old Galen, fought back fiercely, claiming that Hopper was being manipulated by his adult children from previous marriages, who she alleged were trying to cut her out of her inheritance. The legal battle quickly turned ugly. Hopper sought a restraining order against Duffy, while she claimed he was being coerced into the divorce by his children. Even as he underwent grueling cancer treatments, he was forced to deal with depositions, legal filings, and bitter disputes over property, including his beloved art collection. The stress of the divorce, Hopper told friends, was making it difficult for him to fully participate in his cancer treatments and was accelerating his decline. In his final months, Hopper was mostly confined to his home in Venice, California, where he had lived for decades. The once vibrant actor, who has embodied the restless spirit of American cinema, saw his weight plummet to just over 100 pounds, and he was often too weak to speak. Still, he remained lucid and upbeat, and as he accepted his star on the Walk of Fame that morning, much of his old spirit came back to him as he profusely thanked all those who had helped him on his unexpected journey from an impoverished childhood on the plains of Kansas to immense fame and fortune in Hollywood. According to his family, he spent his last few days at peace with his fate, watching old films and listening to music with a small group of close friends by his side. Among them was Jack Nicholson, Hopper's closest friend since the two starred together in Easy Rider in 1969. He said of Hopper, quote, "He was my soul brother. He was an indomitable spirit. He lived on his own terms, a defiant artist to the very end." On May 29, 2010, Dennis Hopper died in his sleep. He was 74 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Dennis Hopper.
Dennis Hopper's journey from a poor farm boy in Dust Bowl-era Kansas to icon of the big screen is one of the most improbable stories in show business. Born at the height of the Great Depression in the rugged town of Dodge City, his early years embodied the rough-edged existence of a frontier town steeped in cowboy mythology. His parents were farmers who fully expected their son to follow a similar path, until fate intervened. At 4 years old, Hopper and his mother were told that his father had been killed in World War II. In reality, though the reasons remain unclear, this was a deliberate deception by the military to conceal his father's true wartime occupation as an intelligence officer for the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, serving in the Pacific Theater. While his father was away and presumed dead, Hopper's mother, Marjorie, noticed her son's early talent for painting and enrolled him in lessons. He took to it immediately, displaying a prodigious ability that soon caught the attention of the small but dedicated artistic community in his hometown. Though he was, for now, far removed from the cultural, coastal, artistic hubs, his early exposure to the arts planted a seed in Hopper's restless mind, one that would eventually lead him to a life far beyond the plains of Kansas. After the war, Hopper's family relocated to Kansas City and later to San Diego, California, offering him a glimpse of a world beyond the windswept plains of Kansas. It was in California that Hopper's artistic instincts took hold, and he immersed himself in the arts. Acting became his newest obsession, and by the time he was a teenager, he was determined to make it in Hollywood. In lieu of college, Hopper enrolled in acting classes at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, and then moved to Los Angeles, where he became fixated on the legends of the silver screen, idolizing actors like James Dean and Marlon Brando, men who Hopper would later say, quote, crackled with raw, unpredictable energy that I want to emulate. In the mid-1950s, Hopper landed small roles in television and film until in 1954, he was cast in 2 movies alongside his idol, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause and Giant. The experiences were transformative for Hopper, as Dean mentored him on set and taught him a more naturalistic approach to acting. Hopper said Dean, quote, taught me how to watch people, how to take from them, and how to feel and use my feelings. But the actor's bond was short-lived. When Dean died in a car crash in September of 1955, Hopper was devastated, later saying that, quote, when Jimmy died, I felt my world had ended. He was everything to me.
Without Dean's mentorship, Hopper began to drift and, like Dean before him, soon developed a reputation for being difficult to work with. But unlike Dean, he wasn't yet famous or charismatic enough to get away with it. He clashed with multiple directors who tried to impose strict direction on him. Derek, I looked into this. Hopper expressed a lot of remorse late in life for the way that he was early on. It wasn't just sort of a little bit surly to work with. He was impossible for directors. He was extremely rebellious. He would speak back to them. He's a young kid at this point. He's in his 20s.
He was a Hollywood bad boy. I mean, that is his reputation, and he lived up to it.
And I think the point about him sort of not having the charisma or fame, like James Dean was also famously tough, but he was also like the it man in Hollywood. Dennis Hopper was just somebody coming along. He met Dean maybe at the wrong time. He was very impressionable and fell into the same patterns. We've seen this before, right? Where you have somebody who's really tough, but they're like the boss. You have to deal with it. And then some of their underlings who come along and act the same way. And you're like, hey,
I don't know who you're talking about.
Wait a second. You can't get away with that. And that's, I think, what he fell into.
Yeah, this is interesting because he looked up to James Dean, who was maybe the most attractive man in Hollywood history and could get away with that. He also looked up to Marlon Brando. Similar, very difficult on set, but Marlon Brando in his prime when he was, Streetcar Named Desire.
He's the most famous actor in the world.
He was beautiful looking.
Right.
I mean, Paul Newman's whole career started because someone wanted someone who looked like Marlon Brando, and we know how handsome Paul Newman is. So Dennis Hopper was more of a character actor look. He had very distinct features, but he didn't have sort of that leading man charm look, but an incredible actor, man. And eventually the talent.
We'll talk about this. He didn't really get away with it. He suffered a huge price. I'll talk about it in a minute. But, we see it today, right? Blake Lively is a very difficult, putting aside the Baldoni stuff, has long had a very difficult reputation, but she's aligned herself with a very successful, famous husband and has, I think, kept her afloat. You had Katherine Heigl. She paid a huge price for her unlikability on set.
Never really recovered from it.
Never really recovered. Christian Bale, another one though, but maybe there's a male-female dynamic. He was able to sort of weather it and be Batman and all the while being really difficult on set.
Yeah, survive that tape about the lighting and being berating someone. Yeah,
exactly. As mentioned, Hopper paid a huge price for his conduct. A director by the name of Henry Hathaway got Hopper blacklisted from major Hollywood productions for nearly a decade after the two tried to work together. During that time, Hopper struggled to find meaningful work, appearing mostly in small television roles. The industry saw him as difficult, unpredictable, and too much of a risk. Whatever roles he did get were small and paid little, and Hopper floundered. But Hopper wasn't content to fade into obscurity. In 1969, he turned his frustrations and countercultural ideals into Easy Rider, a low-budget road movie about 2 bikers traveling through an America that no longer seemed to have a place for them. Hopper co-wrote the movie with Peter Fonda, and, according to legend, much of the film was developed through late-night, drug-fueled conversations in which Hopper and Fonda would hash out ideas and jot them down on whatever scraps of paper they could find. The result was what many deemed to be a perfect movie and an instant cultural phenomenon. It was a box office hit, generating $60 million on just a $350,000 budget. It launched the careers of Hopper, who also directed the film, as well as Fonda and a little-known actor by the name of Jack Nicholson. Even the term Easy Rider gained cultural meaning, becoming shorthand for the counterculture and an anthem for the disillusioned youth of the late 60s. Hopper, with his scruffy beard, tinted sunglasses, and off-kilter energy, became the face of this movement.
You really can't overstate the importance of Easy Rider. If most people who you talk to who are cinephiles will say the 1970s are the greatest decade in all of cinema, and I think the sort of lineup of movies bears that out. It started with Easy Rider and maybe Bonnie and Clyde. Those are the two sort of forerunners of the sort of new Hollywood movement in the 70s. Before then, the acting was very stilted. There were pieces here and there of Marlon Brando that were sort of part of the new Hollywood, but Easy Rider changed cinema.
It's the first movie, and this is something somebody else said, I'm not coining this, but the first movie that celebrated the counterculture. Before that, throughout the 1960s, the counterculture movie like The Graduate and things like that were looked as that's the opposite of what you want to do. That's the evil. That's the villain.
Yes.
And now all of a sudden the counterculture is celebrated. And Easy Rider was the first movie to do that. And then through the 60s and 70s especially, it's all celebrating the counterculture. It's all the rebels, all the way up to like Star Wars celebrating the rebels. It was all about rebellion and celebration of that. Easy Rider was the first movie to do that.
Yeah, the dawn of the anti-hero, it was everything. Jack Nicholson, it's one of his earliest movies. He plays a lawyer in it. It's just, if you look back at that movie, it's seminal. And Dennis Hopper, not only starred in it, was the director of that movie. But just as quickly as he had risen, he fell. The success of Easy Rider gave Hopper carte blanche to direct his next film, The Last Movie, an ambitious, experimental project that was absolutely loathed by audiences and critics. The film flopped, and Hopper, his ego inflated by newfound fame and a near-constant intake of drugs and alcohol, spiraled into a decade of self-destruction. He became notorious for his erratic behavior, holding wild parties where he dabbled in every substance imaginable, and engaged in increasingly paranoid and dangerous antics. Between 1969 and 1976, he was married and divorced 3 times, including to the singer Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, and to whom he was married for just 8 days in 1970. By the late 1970s, Hopper had reached rock bottom. His addiction had made him unemployable, and his paranoia had become so extreme that he was institutionalized after experiencing a psychotic break in Mexico. Most assumed his career was just over. But then, in 1979, Francis Ford Coppola took a chance on him, casting him as the manic, rambling photojournalist in Apocalypse Now. But Hopper arrived on set in the Philippines deep in the throes of his drug addiction, and his inability to memorize his lines due to his cocaine use frustrated Coppola, leading to scenes being rewritten on the fly and shot in fragmented, incoherent manners. Coppola said publicly that Hopper was nearly impossible to work with and brought, quote, madness to the set. But he also confessed this was part of what made Hopper's performance mesmerizing. Hopper's wild-eyed, rambling monologues, made all the more real because Hopper was wasted on set, fed the film's psychedelic intensity. And according to Coppola, Hopper was, quote, completely out of control, but he was brilliant in the role. And yet, despite his incredible performance, his professional reputation remained in tatters, and he again found himself relegated to low-budget foreign productions and obscure, often bizarre roles.
But just when it seemed Dennis Hopper had burned every bridge, he staged one of the most remarkable comebacks in Hollywood history. In 1986, he landed the role that would transform his career and introduce him to an entirely new audience as Wilbur Shooter Flatch, the alcoholic basketball coach seeking redemption in Hoosiers.
All right, now listen to me. All right, this is the last shot that we got. All right? We're going to run the picket fence at him. Merle, you're the swing man. Jimmy, you're solo right. All right, Merle should be open swinging around the end of that fence. Now, boys, don't get caught watching the paint dry.
It's interesting. I read about Hoosiers that the director, David Anspaugh, was apparently terrified when the studio cast Hopper because of his reputation and what it would be like opposite Gene Hackman, who we just did an episode about a couple weeks ago. Hackman was a professional actor, and he did not tolerate nonsense on set.
No nonsense.
No nonsense. Making him easy for directors to work with, but sometimes hard for other actors.
Hit your marks, know your lines, all the things Hopper struggled with, and that unpredictability must have driven Gene Hackman crazy.
So Anspaugh comes into this going, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster, figuring he's going to have to fire Hopper halfway through. Hackman at the time was a really big actor, and he was going to call the shots. Mm-hmm. They apparently loved each other. Yeah. They got along really well. Hopper realized that this is what it's like to be a professional on set. He had never really been around this level of professional on set before, and he fell into it beautifully. Really supporting role, obviously, to Hackman, and he just took sort of guidance from Hackman. Two became friends, and the results on screen were magical. I mean, Hopper gets an Academy Award nomination for his role as Shooter.
Yeah.
Really impressive stuff.
And it's incredible on screen because you can see Gene Hackman came into acting pretty late in his life, so there was a sort of paternal relationship that you could see. He just grabbed him by the scruff of his neck. They're roughly contemporaries, I would imagine, in age. Yeah. But Gene Hackman and their approaches were so different. But you want both. The magic of Hoosiers is Hopper's character is so erratic and wild-eyed, and Gene Hackman is so steady.
Yeah.
And so that's the magic of the movie is you have that push-pull, that yin-yang, and it's an incredible performance.
You can imagine Director Anspaugh's like fear when this gets cast, and he's like, oh my God, what a combustible combination, but it turned out to be great. The success of Hoosiers marked the beginning of a new phase in Hopper's career and saw him take on some of those memorable roles of the 20th century. As a psychotic Frank Booth in David Lynch's Blue Velvet, he terrified audiences with an unhinged, volatile presence, delivering lines like, "Don't you fucking look at me," with a terrifying mix of rage and vulnerability. Do you like my little version?
It was very, very good. I revisited Blue Velvet because David Lynch just passed, and that was spot on.
Thank you very much. 8 years later, he played a similar character in a very different role as Howard Payne, the vengeful bomber tormenting Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock in Speed.
He's so persistent, he always gets his man. Wouldn't be able to interest you in a bribe, would I? I've got plenty to go around.
I want to pause on Speed because that was basically my introduction to Dennis Hopper. It came out in 1994.
Yeah, Hoosiers was mine. You and I are about 10 years
right.
apart. Those movies are about 10 years apart. The exact same thing.
He's sensational in it because Keanu Reeves at that point in time was considered, not the best actor.
At that point in time?
Yeah. He was always known as sort of a very flat affect, and it works in Speed, but you need some charisma jumping off the screen. And so Hopper as the villain, he is able to harness that unpredictability of his persona into this character who's always carrying a bomb and planting one under a bus, and it crackles.
He's incredible.
As the villain in that movie.
I think with a flatter villain, you couldn't have gotten, even a great actor, but he could have played a flatter, you couldn't have gotten there. But his like intensity and the manicness and the craziness that he had really brought that sort of villain to life. It was great.
It's the best. But despite his professional resurgence, Hopper's personal life remained turbulent. He married 2 more times, including to Victoria Duffy when he was 60 years old. 5 years later, Duffy gave birth to their daughter, Galen. And despite his advanced age, Dennis Hopper was, by all accounts, a devoted father and had a close relationship with his daughter, who he described as the central figure in his life. The same, however, cannot be said for Hopper's relationship with Duffy. Their relationship became marred by public disputes, and the deterioration affected not only Hopper's personal life, but also his health. As he faced ongoing health struggles, including his prostate cancer diagnosis in 2009, the emotional strain from the fractured relationship with Duffy seemed to exacerbate his condition, further complicating his final years with legal battles over finances and custody of their daughter, adding to the emotional toll.
You weren't here yet when we were covering Dennis Hopper's crazy divorce. It was every day in the news, top of the site kind of stuff, really nasty stuff being said back and forth. Really unfortunate because this little girl was caught in the middle of it. I mean, I think he was 65 when he had her. So by the time this is coming along, he's now in his early 70s. And I don't know whose side you're on. We always seem to be on Dennis Hopper's side in this thing, but maybe that's unfair. But, his estranged wife, Victoria Duffy, was after a lot of money from his estate, and he was trying to prevent her from getting it, and she was claiming that the kids were taking it. Was really sad.
It was volatile. He was married a number of times, though. Look, Dennis Hopper was a handful to deal with. One of his wives actually is on The Pit now, the show that we both love.
Oh, yeah?
Yes.
Catherine
Lanasso was an ex of Dennis Hopper. She's got a role on The Pit, and she's so steely-nerved.
Yeah.
To deal with someone like Dennis Hopper in a marriage, it's hard to imagine. We're both married.
Yeah.
You have to have a level of equanimity to just deal with the ups and downs of a marriage. I don't think Dennis Hopper was known for that.
But one of the things that came out of it is he had one of the most extensive private art collections of anybody I've ever heard of. He had Warhols and Basquiat's, he had Lichtensteins, David Hockney, Banksy's. And obviously this is part of what they were fighting over, right? Was that she was claiming an interest in this art, and the kids are obviously saying no, it's ours because. Yeah. I can't imagine how much those paintings are worth. I mean, a single Hockney recently sold for, I think, $90 million. So you're talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of art here, and a lot to fight over and really nasty stuff.
Yeah. Despite the turmoil in his personal life, though, Dennis Hopper ultimately found solace in the closing chapters of his life. In his final years, he sought peace through reflection and re-engagement with his passions, including his art and love of filmmaking. Though his health was failing, Hopper found comfort in his close circle of friends, some of whom had been with him through the highs and the lows of his career. These connections, combined with his devotion to his daughter, provided him with a sense of peace and purpose as he neared the end. Hopper ultimately found a measure of the resolution he'd spent his whole life seeking, embracing the quiet moments of his final days.
Through all of the turbulence in Dennis Hopper's life, the marriages and divorces, failures and successes, and the career that was lost and resurrected over and over again, one constant remained. His unwavering bond with Jack Nicholson, a friendship that endured from Easy Rider in 1969 through Hopper's final days over 40 years later. Nicholson said upon Hopper's death, "Dennis was one of those guys who lived his life like no one else. He was a guy who put everything into his work, his passion, his art. He wasn't afraid to go to places where others wouldn't dare, and he had this ability to embrace the chaos of life. People didn't always understand him, but that was part of his charm. He had an intensity that was unmatched. Whether he was making a movie, painting a canvas, or just having a conversation. He wasn't afraid to go to the dark places, but at the same time, he had this incredible light. He was a paradox, a true artist in every sense of the word, And that's why he'll always be remembered, because Dennis Hopper was never just one thing. He was everything, all at once. And in a world full of imitators, he was the real deal.